a link in the chat here for a Miro board for this talk. I like to make these as interactive as possible. So you should be able to click on that link, and if you have you don't have to have a named account, you should be able to just get in anonymously. And I'll go ahead and screen share while we're at it. We're going to keep it simple, so I'm not going to do, if you're not familiar with the Miro tool, just to dive right into it, it's pretty straightforward, but we're going to keep it really simple for this. I did want to do a few things just to get some feedback from folks as we go. So again, thanks again for having me and for joining in today. Quick little intro on myself. So I am an enterprise agility coach. I am currently coaching with Agile Velocity. So Agile Velocity was on the screen earlier that Ben was showing, and David Hawks, the founder of Agile Velocity, will be the keynote at CAW. So any of you that haven't been to Keep Agile Austin in past years, I encourage you to go. I've been in the past. It's a great event. Real quick background on myself. I'm a continuous learner. I started learning, practicing Agile way back in early 2000s, right around the time that the Agile Manifesto was being created and coming into our consciousness. And I still find that I'm a learner and a practitioner. As long as I've been doing this, I keep finding new ways to think about it, new ways to approach it, and certainly learning from my colleagues that I coach with and the clients and the companies that I work with as well. This topic we're going to talk about today, STATIK, which is an acronym that stands for Systems Thinking Approach to Implementing Kanban. Several years ago, working with a number of teams, I started experimenting on how to apply STATIK and found that it was really impactful for a variety of teams, not just teams that are going to be applying the Kanban method explicitly, but even teams that are applying other approaches, namely Scrum. And so I started practicing with this with a few colleagues and found that it was a really powerful technique. And I've refined it over the years and find that it can be a pretty cool technique to use with teams. Knowing that this is a Agile at Scale SIG, we'll try to bring in some scaling context into the conversation as we're going through today, and see if we can make it relate a little bit to the topic of at scale. As we get started, I'd like to kind of just check the group and get some input here. So if you're in the Miro board, I've got a couple of polling questions I wanted to tease up and see what we think about these things. So I'm going to go ahead, I've staged some dots, but I'm going to go ahead and use the polling feature inside of Miro here. I'm going to give you each 2 votes. And what I want you to do is consider the 2 questions that I've framed up here. One is around dealing with, go ahead and start the poll. See if I can do this properly. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one. See, best laid plans and for all. Close it. Sorry about that, a little misfire on the Miro tool. Let's try this again. There we go, that should get it. So just curious on your thoughts on how well you think about your teams in the question around scaling. So when you're dealing with teams at scale, the first question is it more important to have all the teams applying the same approach, or is having teams choose their approach based on their context more important? And then the second question to consider is, what have you seen in the past? Have you been with teams that have switched between Scrum and Kanban, or maybe even tried the so-called hybrid of Scrumban? Curious to get everybody's take on that. Looks like we got about 14 votes so far, and a few dots flying in there as well. So if you want to vote with dots or you want to use the polling, that's fine. couple more seconds. All right, so it looks like we've got a pretty good mix as I expected. So about 5 people feeling like at scale, it's important that all of our teams are applying the same approach. We've got a number of votes also around allowing each team to choose their context. And I'm particularly curious when I see teams that have switched between Scrum and Kanban, what was that experience? I will say one of my continuous observations when I'm observing teams and working with organizations as a coach, there's this perception that Scrum is, too hard sometimes, or they're getting hung up on certain elements of it. And we look at Kanban. Kanban's a very simple method, so let's just switch over to Kanban. It will be easier. And what I always like to emphasize that context matters, right? So whether we're trying to solve complex adaptive problems, or whether we're trying to deal with challenges of flow and how do we balance our throughput, right? Really understanding that context can be important. And when we're trying to talk about how we do this at scale, I think it's equally relevant to think about this context. So I'm real curious for those of you on the question around teams at scale, anybody want to share an example of when you've had all of the teams using the same approach? What benefits did that give you? Or maybe you voted for the teams having the choice based on their context. What might be some benefits one way or another when we're talking about how teams are performing or how teams are operating at scale? Anybody would like to share an idea?
Hey there, this is Jay. I'm a little bit biased towards Kanban, as some of the people who know me on the call. But I see some major challenges with just the sprint-based approach, especially at scale. It becomes harder and harder to get things done for large organizations. But I'm a big fan of start with what you're doing now. So if you're starting with Scrum, you start with Scrum and you introduce these practices as you go to get better outcomes, right? And so it's all about the metrics and what metrics are you driving, and then the feedback loops. And so I love the static approach, so I'm really glad you're here talking about it. But I didn't get a chance to vote because I couldn't get in quick enough, but I would say each team should choose their approach, right? Because they do, I think, have their own unique way of working in different contexts for sure.
Great. Thanks for that insight, Jay. All right. Anyone else like to add a comment?
Hi, yeah, this is Tom Bulkey. So I think it kind of depends on what we're talking about, and this falls into the category of centralized decision-making versus decentralized decision-making. I think there are some things when it comes to how you're using the tools, the processes of how you're moving things along. When you're at scale, if every team is using the tools differently, it's really difficult to roll that data up in a way that's meaningful, that can be self-service and not verbal. And so I think there's a time and a place to have some of the processes be aligned as much as possible. But then also when it comes down to the nuts and bolts of what the team is doing for their work and how maybe they're breaking stories into tasks, or maybe even taking a feature and decomposing that into stories, you can allow some freedom there for how they're doing the actual work. But I think when it comes to processes and tools, if for any of your reporting needs or a way to be able to determine what the entire art is doing, it's good for them to have similar processes.
Yeah, thank you for that as well. So I always like to get other people's insights and thoughts on the topic. I've been doing this a long time at scale and otherwise, and always find that I often refer to Agile in general, and certainly when we're talking about the challenge of scaling across a large enterprise, this is a non-binary challenge, right? There's no right or wrong answer in all cases. And we have various frameworks and approaches we can apply to this, but even then, right, we want to make sure that we're applying these things in their context. So thank you for that insight. So a little bit about this static workshop that I have been running for many years with teams. Again, it is based on the approach of taking this systems thinking mindset and then ultimately implementing the Kanban method. But as I said, even if we're not applying the Kanban method, I find a lot of value in being able to do this. And I've essentially designed this into a form of a team chartering workshop. And so, in fact, just ran a series of this at a client very recently. And I think 9 out of the 10 teams will be applying Scrum. One of the teams will essentially be a typical shared services team, so they'll be applying Kanban. But all of the teams went through this same workshop together. I have some facilitator tips for those of you that choose to try to apply this. I can include some content for you, and you're free to share this and apply this. So after this session, if you want to reach out to me, I can give you access to some of this content. And I always simply ask, if you're trying this out there in the wild in your organizations, please give me feedback. I always like to hear from people that are trying this, and what can I learn from your experiences, and how can we keep improving this? One thing I always like to reiterate from a facilitator perspective is what I call kind of lowercase Kanban versus uppercase Kanban, which is Kanban as a system, right? How do we visualize and see the work versus Kanban, the method? And so whether you're applying the method of Kanban or not, taking this approach and using it to try to either launch new teams or realign existing teams, it can be pretty valuable. And again, when we're talking about scaling, more often than not, we're talking about meeting existing teams where they are and finding ways for designing how those systems work together. And obviously, there's going to be some new team design going on in there as well. I've run this workshop in a variety of formats. I've run it as a kind of a large 2-day event. With the last couple of years doing everything virtually, it feels like we've been forced to condense things down. So I've worked on condensing this down. We ran it as a half-day workshop recently with a couple of teams. We got a pretty good outcome, but I do feel like taking the time to go through these types of activities is really important, and really depends on where the team is in their overall understanding of their work. One of the things I tried and have been doing is I've created each step in this process, essentially create a story for these. And what we'll do is when we're launching a team or going through this workshop, we'll essentially build a very quick backlog together as a team, and we'll create a story, including acceptance criteria for each of the steps that STATIK provides to us. That I found helps people on teams get a real easy connection to what we're trying to do, because most of us are familiar with the concept or the practice of user stories and acceptance criteria. So it really helps connect us to that. So I'm going to show you in a minute how I've designed some of those. I also want to point out, this is not my brainchild. I am standing on the shoulders of giants, as we say. So I've certainly learned from others. I've borrowed ideas from David Anderson, from Mike Burrows, Luke Homan, and other colleagues of mine that I've worked with. So there's some reference here for those of you that want to look at some other ideas or the supporting theories or practices behind what I'm doing here. All right. So what I would like to do is just take each step, take you through each step and talk to you about how I approach this. And as I mentioned, I like to keep a dialogue here. So, I'll make space for some conversation, and I've got some space on the right here of the Miro board that I'd like to get some input. So as I step through each of these, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and show you. On the right here, I've got a large frame titled Workshop Content. So this is the actual content that I've been using most recently virtually. And as you can see, there's some standard workshop setup, like most of you, I'm sure, have used something like this. And then, as I mentioned, each step in the STATIK model, I have a story in a backlog that describes what we're trying to accomplish and has some guidance, some prompting questions for the teams. And we have some activities that we may choose to do depending on the context of the team. So I'm just sharing that with you so you have a visual of what might be included in the actual workshop if you were facilitating this virtually. Particularly, I want to note off to the right here, I've also got a white frame. So as I'm going through the content today, please feel free to drop a sticky over here on the right in this area for any ideas that you have. If you've used one of the techniques that I'm suggesting and you've got some feedback on that, or you've got some other ideas, maybe you've done something different with your teams, I encourage you that as we're going through this, drop a sticky in here with whatever idea you might have, and we'll try to check in on those before we wrap up today. Okay, so those of you that are in the Miro board, feel free to use that space. All right, so the overall agenda for the workshop is here. So STATIK is a pretty straightforward approach. It essentially includes 7 steps that I've got listed here. And these are, those of you that are familiar with Lean or Kanban method are probably familiar with a lot of this terminology, but we start by making sure we're discussing and understanding fit for purpose as a team. Again, whether we're launching a new team, so we're forming a new team, or we're working with teams that are well formed, maybe they've been working together for a little while, but we have to do some realignment or adjust the team's focus, making sure that the team is properly constructed and understands the problem that they're trying to solve is a really important first step. So first step in STATIK is fit for purpose. Then we talk about analyzing the demand. So where is the work coming from? What are the characteristics of the demand that the teams are expected to be focusing on? Step 3 is to look at our capacity. I'm going to pause here because I forgot to mention earlier, the way I apply this in the context of team chartering is not straight out of the box. It's not by the book. I've made some adaptations and I try to blend some things where I need to. So as I'm going through this, you'll probably notice that I might take some liberties in a few areas where I'm merging a few ideas, and I might even bifurcate a few of these and split them out and talk about them in different ways. So this is my adaptation of the standard model. Step 4, modeling the workflow. We will sit down with the team. We'll actually visually map out how we think work should flow as a team. I like to highlight step 4 because this is one that I've always found interesting when I'm working with teams, whether development delivery teams or even management teams, that most individuals have a sense of how we work or what our workflow looks like. And often, if it's not documented, if it's not visible, we've got all of these ideas up here in our head. And if I'm talking to a team of 8 or 9 or 10 team members, what we have is possibly 8 or 9 or 10 different versions of the truth. And so the process of actually mapping this out, getting it out there and visible is pretty powerful because we can remove some of those biases or some of those misconceptions. But a lot of times teams think they know how work flows, but we don't really understand it until we start to visualize it. Step 5 is around discovering our classes of service. So we talk about what are the different types of work that are flowing through. And then step 6 is we actually start designing our Kanban system. I think this is one of the most powerful and quite frankly, interesting aspects of the STATIK approach is that we don't just start off by building our Kanban board. We do the work to understand our system, how we work together. And then once we get that understanding, then we start to think about how we're going to design our ultimate system. And I see a lot of teams make that mistake, whether they're just starting straight up with Kanban or they're making the transition from Scrum, is they think all they need to do is create a Kanban board or use what Jira gives them or whatever the tool is, and they think they're done. And this systems thinking approach is really impactful in that sense. All right, so I've designed the workshop around this, and I'll flow through the steps with you guys next. All right, so as I mentioned, I create a story for each of these items, so it is an easy connection for the team. So we start off talking about fit for purpose. And as you can see here, I've designed a story that kind of explains why fit for purpose is something we're going to talk about. And I have some acceptance criteria that we look toward. Now, again, depending on the team, is this a newly forming team or is it an existing team? There may be a variety of things that we might need to do here. So if we're newly forming a team, we might start by understanding our norms. We might do some activities around team formation, et cetera. And if we're dealing with a mature team and a team that's been working for a while, we might do slightly different things. Again, I have some guidance for facilitation over here on the left to help us think about how we might go about doing some of this. And what I really find impactful is some of these prompting questions. So how do we start to think about us as a team and what are we going to be able to do at this stage? So if we're a newly formed team, maybe we do some standard activities like a market of skills, or we do some traditional team forming activities. If we're an existing team, we might pull up our existing team working agreements. We might pull up our backlog. We might look at things and evaluate how well we've been working. Maybe we've got new team members that don't quite understand how we work. So you notice here on the right, I've got a couple of different activities that we might do. So we may be starting from scratch talking about mission, vision, values. We may be focused on a product. If so, maybe we need to create our product vision, or maybe we need to revisit or update our product vision. Or sometimes we just need to get reconnected on what our decision-making situation looks like. One of the things I've found with teams that have been working together for a while is they don't go back and reinforce their working agreements. And so the decisions that have to get made along the way somehow just kind of fall to the background, or they become assumed. And again, people have them in their mind, but they haven't really taken the time to reevaluate them or codify them. So again, depending on what the state of the team is, we might do a few activities to get us understanding, are we designed? Do we understand the work that we're supposed to be doing? Do we understand who we're doing that work for? Okay. The next step is we look at sources of dissatisfaction. So now here, if we're forming a brand new team, we may not have any data. We may not have any reference point here. If we're an existing team, we hopefully have some former retrospective. We've got some data that we can rely on. If need be, we might do some surveys to go talk to customers or users. But it's really about making sure that we understand what are the pain points and what are the sources of dissatisfaction that we need to start to focus on from a delivery perspective as well as a continuous improvement perspective. So as I mentioned, if it's an existing team, hopefully there's a recent retrospective that we might be able to pull from. If not, we might do a lightweight retrospective at this point. I'm a big fan of sailboat, speedboat retros at this type of level, because we're not necessarily looking at specific process improvements. We're trying to think a little bit more broadly and a little bit more creatively. So you can choose your retro approach, but sometimes we do an explicit retro. Other times we just do some brainstorming on what some of those things might be. So again, here on the right, I've got an example of how we might do that virtually. And we just simply do some brainstorming around pain points, impediments, et cetera. And then we might prioritize those as a team. Okay. Once we do that, then we get into step 3, which is around analyzing our demand. So where is our work coming from? Who is it coming from? What are the characteristics of the demand as it flows into a team? This is one area for Scrum teams particularly that often doesn't get enough systems thinking applied to it, because oftentimes when I ask teams that are applying Scrum, the answer will be, well, our product owner, of course. Product owner puts stuff in our backlog, prioritizes our backlog, and then we just pull those things into our next sprint. And if the team doesn't really have a deep enough appreciation for the sources of that demand or the frequency or some of the other characteristics of that demand, that may impact their ability to flow through this. So this is an important activity to start to think about the different variations that might exist on how they're going to be working. Now, I'm going to pause here because when we're talking about teams at scale, This is particularly important if we start to elevate this conversation up to what we call the system level, meaning teams of teams. So I'm guessing many of you may be familiar with and have experience around the technique of value stream mapping. So if we're talking about trying to scale up a handful of teams, and if these teams are all part of the same delivery system, the same value system, this particular topic, I find, has some pretty impactful ramifications when we start to look across a value delivery system as opposed to a discrete team. And what I find is looking at the multiple sources of demand and the multiple characteristics of that demand can get quite complicated when we're talking about a complicated delivery system. Certainly, if we're talking about multiple teams having to work together, it's not as simple as saying, well, we've got 10 teams that have to work together to deliver this product or this capability. Each product owner has their prioritized backlog. We know it's not that simple, that there's probably a higher level set of criteria, a higher level set of demand that needs to flow through. So particularly when we're talking about looking at teams at scale, this topic here can quite frankly stand on its own as a major workshop and a major effort to try to understand where is the work coming from and what are the characteristics of that work. Okay. As we do that, then we get into step 4, which is around analyzing our capacity. So this is one of those areas that I've tweaked a bit. I've adapted this, and it ties a little bit to step 1, which is fit to purpose. So I get a little creative at this point. Here, we're talking about capacity in a couple of different ways. We're talking about capacity in terms of, do we have the right people on the team? Do we have the right skill sets on the team? Are we all committed to the work? I'm guessing all of us have seen, and maybe sadly are part of, a condition that we see in a lot of organizations where we're splitting people across multiple teams, projects, products, etc. And so this question of capacity in a pure sense, am I 100% committed to this team? Am I 100% committed to the work that we're doing? Or am I having to split my time across other teams? This is what I kind of refer to as the silent assassin within organizations. So much waste gets created in organizations because we don't really pay attention to the impacts of having people spread across multiple teams or splitting their time across multiple projects or initiatives. And while there's a strong sense from management often to do this because we have limited capacity, most of us that are in this business know that that generally generates more waste than it actually solves the problem. And so when we're talking about making sure that teams can understand how do they properly form or reform, or how do they handle what they're trying to do as a team, whether it be Scrum or Kanban, this is one of the things that we really want to focus on. When it comes to the skills competency side of it, what we'll often do is essentially create a skills competency matrix. So I've got a couple of images here on the right that you can see. I'll zoom in a little bit. These are some actual examples pre-COVID, if you will, when we were doing these things in person. And often what we'll do is we'll get the team together and we will identify all of the skill sets and competencies that we need to do the work that we believe we're being asked to do. And so we're talking about technical skills here. We're also talking about soft skills. And we simply ask each team member to self-assess given each of those skills or competencies that we've identified. This has two real values to it. One is, obviously, we can identify gaps. So if we find that we have a particular skills gap or competency gap, now we can go to leadership and we can say, in order for us to be successful, we need to address this gap in some form. It also serves a bigger benefit of upskilling all of us on the team. So if somebody on the team is an expert in a certain area, but the rest of us maybe are novices or we're struggling to kind of improve our skill there, we can build some explicit mentorship relationships within the team. We can build in this culture of learning by really understanding our skills, our competencies around this, and our capabilities and capacity to do the work.
Hey, Richard, it looks
Yeah.
like Tom has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so say for example, you've got a platform team that you're trying to get set up as a Kanban team, and understanding that as a platform, you have multiple business, counterparts that are coming in with demand for that. Capacity usually has some relationship to budget. In your experience, or what you've observed, when the team has to take some of that capacity to, do the care and feeding and the maintenance of the platform, how do they come up with a capacity allocation model for that type of work when it's difficult to trace who pays for that?
Right. Great question. And part of that will be, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. When we get down into step 6, or story 6 is around discovering classes of service, we can address part of that there, right? So how do we understand the nature of the demand? And this is true of most teams that I find, right? There's often not a single source nor a single type of demand that a team might have to deal with. So there are a couple of things that we will do there. Number one is making sure that we properly analyze what are the characteristics of that demand, so that we understand what that is really about. For example, the frequency. So to the question, right, how frequently do we need to deal with that type of work or that demand? The other is tying into where I pause is, what are our capabilities around our ability to do that type of work, whether it's platform type work or new development work, supporting production, et cetera. So we start by having that analysis. We amplify it by understanding our capacity and capabilities around that. And then we can support that, if we jump ahead a little bit, by discussing various classes of service. So I'll touch on that a little bit more when we get to that next step. And then the answer around the budget piece, that one, I will lean on my consultative, it depends response, because it depends on how fungible and how flexible is that budget. And is that budget explicitly defined in a way that the team is confident that they can apply a certain amount of capacity and effort and focus to that given that budget? Or is it more dynamic? And if they're having to deal with other types of demand and having to make those decisions in the face of some explicit and some not so explicit budget constraints, that, again, that's hard to pinpoint the right way to go about that. I would lean on the principles of Kanban to say, well, we experiment, right? So we visualize it, we start to apply this, and then we essentially use the data, and we pay attention to the flow to make sure that we can better refine our understanding of how we're going to make those decisions as we go.
Hey, and can I add one other thing to the answer there? I would also say it takes a pretty high maturity level team to be able to manage their work in that way. It doesn't happen overnight, and I haven't seen a lot of teams at that high maturity level in order to be able to manage work in a way that you're talking about with budgeting.
Yeah. I will agree with that. The budgeting question, again, varies from, I work with a lot of different organizations, and I'm always fascinated that some organizations are very disciplined and rigorous when it comes to budgeting, and other organizations are much less so. But they may still have certain expectations on their teams of how they're going to manage to that. And so I do agree. I will say that from a maturity perspective, again, this is where Agile in general, but certainly Kanban and Scrum both help, is that we learn as we go, right? So we learn by doing, and by effectively trying to manage the work as a team in a visible and transparent way. And then we use the best information, the best feedback that we have to improve our decision-making as we go. Thank you for that. All right. Step 5, I referenced step 5 is one of the more impactful areas for me. as a coach, and have been coaching for many, many years with lots of teams and companies. But modeling the workflow, right? So I'm sure we've all got experience on doing process flow mapping or value stream mapping, or just modeling how work flows through us. The key thing here that I've always found, again, is we've got to do this together as a team, and we've got to do this visually. And so this is quite simply the activity, the point where we say, all right, we understand our sources of demand, we understand the problems we're trying to solve, we understand a sense on what that demand looks like, and now let's start making sure that we can map out how things actually flow through us as a team. I like to point out here with teams that are applying the Scrum framework, this is often an underappreciated activity and an underappreciated part of the thinking, because a lot of Scrum teams I've seen simply, well, we've got our sprint, again, we've got our backlog, our product owner tells us what the priority is, we pull in a bunch of work and we work on it for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. And then we get some stuff done, maybe we get all of our work done, or maybe we have things rolling over. But it's just this simple, we have work that we do, we pull it in the sprint, we do the work. And if we don't really start to unpack and peel back the layers of how we work as a team, then we're likely going to miss a lot of opportunity to optimize the flow and to take advantage of our collective knowledge and skills. And so we want to really spend the time here to be able to understand how work flows. Now, obviously, this depends on how the team is constructed. So going back to our capacity or purpose activities, we need to know, do we really are we cross-functional? Do we really have everything we need to contain within our system as a team to be able to deliver what we need to? And again, I'll kind of scroll over here to the right, and I typically will just have the teams go into breakout groups and do some mapping. So quickly visualize how we think work flows through us as a team. And I like to do breakout groups here, depending on the size of the team, because if we do this as one big team, we might get one version of the truth, or maybe a couple of examples. But by doing breakout groups, it's a version of diverge, converge thinking. So we do a couple of breakout groups, and then we bring our ideas back together, and we see where we might have different variances, that sort of thing. Okay. All right. Keeping an eye on the clock here. So step 6 is around discovering classes of service. So if you're not familiar with the concept of classes of service, it's simply a way to identify and think about how we might prioritize our work, essentially the rules of the game. So we might have different types of work, different classes of service of work that may influence prioritization decisions. It may influence the flow of how things go through our team, may influence our definition of done, may influence our SLAs, etc. So identifying those classes of service, again, whether we're applying the Kanban method or we're applying Scrum or some other approach, is a really important technique, because if all work is deemed the same, then it can get confusing when we have work items that are in flow and new demand comes in, or some interruption or disruption might happen to our flow in making those decisions. So I find that defining our classes of service is really critical, so that the team understands this is how we're going to make decisions, and these are somewhat the rules of the game. This is also helpful for our stakeholders, obviously. So if I'm a stakeholder of the team, and I don't have any sense of different classes of service that my team, this team might be working on, I might unintentionally but selfishly think, well, hey, I just requested this, and this is the only thing that this team is working on, or my stuff is always going to be the highest priority stuff. So we need to make sure that teams understand their classes of service and can design it. And as I said, even if the team is applying the Scrum framework, this is a pretty important thing to understand, because as we're making those prioritization decisions and pulling work in and understanding how we're going to structure the way that we work together as a team within the sprint, this can be a really helpful technique to make sure that we're making sound decisions as we go. All right. Story number 7 is where the magic happens, right? So, and as I said, this is what I think is the most impactful part of STATIK, is that we don't try to design our Kanban system from the top, right? We do the work as a group to understand how things need to be or may need to be. And now we start to design our Kanban system. So with Kanban, one of the things that I think is awesome about Kanban is that there's no right or wrong way to design our Kanban board, and the boundaries of our Kanban system may vary from team to team or from context to context. So this is where the teams can ostensibly use some creativity and bring to bear their understanding of their work. Now, if the teams are locked into a rigid configuration from a tool like Jira, well, this may not give them much flexibility. They may be bound to some preset configuration, but hopefully not. I will encourage teams, if you want to get creative, we'll go talk to your Jira administrator or your ADO administrator and see how much flexibility you have in terms of changing that configuration or being creative here. And again, if we ever get back to fully in-person co-located teams, certainly doing these things visibly and creating physical Kanban boards is something that we'll get back to. But this is really key for the team to be able to start to design what their Kanban system is going to look like. And again, we will build on the things that we've done up to this point, and we'll visualize some of this. So what I'll have the teams do is model what they think their Kanban system needs to look like. And it's not just a factor of taking that workflow and dropping it into swim lanes or columns. It's really a process, again, of thinking through how things need to flow and what are the context or boundaries of our Kanban system. So what I try to do is carefully guide them through not just taking that workflow and putting columns in place, but really thinking through what are the decisions that they need to make, right? So what swim lanes might they need to include? What columns might they need to show? What are the WIP limits that they're going to start with? Where do they think bottlenecks or impediments are going to show up? And again, if this is an existing team, they should have some empirical evidence. They should have some experience that helps them start to answer these. If they're a newly formed team, well, we make the best decisions we can based on what we know, and then we go about trying to apply our best efforts to this. And then lastly is in the static model, it essentially says, we'll roll it out and inspect and adapt. I apply what I call team priming. This actually term I borrowed from a colleague many years ago. He and I were co-facilitating this workshop. It was a term that he used. So I stole it from him and I continue to use it. But team priming is essentially, do we have everything that we need to go forward and be successful? So as we've done this work, we understand how our system needs to be designed. Now it's all about making sure that we give the team the opportunity to talk about how can we be successful. And so I've got an activity here and we talk about the tools we may need, the knowledge we need, the environments we need, or the people we need. All of this is being built on by going through each step. Now, again, if we're talking about multiple teams at scale, we will aggregate that and we will then think about this is the need of the system. And certainly at this point, we will talk to management and say, all right, you want these teams to be successful. This is what the team needs from you as a leadership or as management to be able to enable them to go forward. So that's a very quick run through of the model and how I facilitate it. I'm just going to do a quick scan here. I don't see any stickies that have popped up, but yeah. This is how I've designed the workshop. This is something that I have made publicly available, so I'm happy to share this with folks if anybody's interested. I do want to go point out 2 resources that you can take advantage of. Number one is I wrote a blog about this back in 2020, I believe. You can go find that on the Agile Velocity website. Here's the link, and it steps you through. It's kind of a how-to. How this would be applied. And I've also put a backup of this Miro board, a version of this Miro board in Dropbox. So this is something that folks can download. And if you are a Miro user, you can download the backup file and apply it. Again, the only thing I ask for folks that are applying this is if you're reusing any of the actual content, just keep some of the attributions there and make sure you quote the resources. And more importantly, if you are applying this, you are trying this out, I would love to hear your feedback. I would love to hear, did it work well? What did you learn from it? Maybe you've got a better idea that I could borrow back, and would love to get your experiences on that. And I just noticed, apparently my video froze up a while back, but hopefully everybody's still hearing me.
Yeah, we could still hear you. It's just
Excellent.
fine. So thanks, Richard. We did have some questions in the chat. Let me go back to the first one that I see from Sat. What would you recommend to get this skill matrix for countries who have European mindset and work council issues?
Yes. So I'm experiencing that right now. So we're working with a group in Europe. We've got 8 teams in Europe that we're starting to work with, and we're ultimately, in this case, we're going to be applying Scaled Agile. So we're ultimately going to be launching an ART here between now and Q4. So I guess my short answer is, well, let's just be realistic and let's be transparent about what those constraints, whether it be capacity constraints or skills constraints, et cetera. So I think the idea, the model is universal, but as always, we want to take cultural considerations. We want to take geography considerations, and just be realistic and be true about it. The group that I just mentioned, we had to hit the pause button this summer because everybody's going on holiday. So the pace of getting things done has definitely slowed down. But generally speaking, I just always reinforce transparency, and let's be pragmatic about what we're doing here.
Cool. Thanks for that answer, Richard. This is a suggestion that came from Ned. You might want to do the model the workflow story with your Scrum team since it's underappreciated, i.e. not actually addressed by the framework.
Yeah. I agree. And again, this is the original version of this workshop, and this talk was applying static for Scrum teams. And so that's how I first started adapting this. And again, I've found that too often Scrum teams just take that aspect for granted. And I agree, it is absolutely underappreciated in that space.
I was just, I attributed that to Richard. That was just one that really landed, struck home for me. Even if you're a Scrum partisan, this is something you need to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we had another comment from Jay saying, if you are constrained by a Jira workflow, you can't change. Park stories in a swim lane at the top of with the label work policy and put all the policies needed to move work from one column to the next. So Richard, are you still there?
Yeah, I am. I'm seeing if my video will return. Apparently it won't. Yeah, I think, one of the keys of this in general is, do what makes sense, but also there is, understanding the constraints that we have, right? So operating within the constraints that we have as teams or as an organization. So if what Jay's suggesting is just by labeling it and making it explicit as a policy constraint or something that might be a barrier from that perspective, certainly at least calls attention to it. I would question the what next, right? What do we do with this? So it's one thing to label something. The question would be, what can we do with that? Or is that it? And if that's something that we can simply use to create visibility for management, to say this is slowing us down, this is creating a bottleneck, this is creating some form of sub-optimization, then certainly highlighting those, amplifying those so that stakeholders see it, managers see it is always a good thing.
So I can go into just a little bit. So it kind of goes back to your
original point where you have, teams that kind of have the tribal knowledge and the expectations aren't set. And so this kind of allows you that opportunity for the team to say, hey, even though we're using Jira and we can't change the workflow that we're using, at least in our in progress column, we can, label a story so we can separate it out into its own swim lane at the very top of the board. And then we can, have that checklist of all the things that we need to do in order to move a work item from, in progress to the next step, right? And it could be different types of work. It could get very detailed. You could do a lot of different things with it in order to, get that understanding across the team to make it explicit, to your point.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we've got time for one last question from Ned in the chat. How often would you rerun the workshop as a process improvement activity?
Yeah.
And who is in this workshop? The team only or management too?
Yeah. Great questions. I will often rerun parts of the workshop over time. Right. So I mentioned earlier, I originally designed this as a full-blown 2-day team chartering event. And inevitably, every client I work with, there's some compelling reason that we need to compress time, right? We couldn't possibly allocate 2 days for this. So we squeeze it into 1 day. And then we couldn't possibly allocate a whole day to this. So we squeeze it into a half day. So those are, again, constraints that often get enforced on the teams. So part of that will depend on how much we have to go back in and reiterate and or just simply iterate through. So oftentimes, if we are compressed on time, we'll highlight the most important aspects of the static model to get us moving forward. And then, yes, we'll come back and we'll iteratively pick up on some of the other pieces. And then what I encourage the teams themselves is yes, revisit certain aspects of this over time so that you can continue to refine your system for you. Now, at scale, this is also a challenge as well. So the question of who's involved. So at the pure team level, we pretty much keep it to the team. But when we are talking about dealing with this and taking a scaled view at it, we want to make sure that we have that systems level view. So I do encourage quote frontline management and system level management to be involved, because they tend to be the ones that can help calibrate, turn the dials to help create opportunities for teams to be more efficient and to remove some of the waste and to better see how these things work. So certainly at scale, it should be a much broader contribution than at an explicit team level.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that information, Richard, and that answer. We are pretty much at time here. If you want to post your contact info in the chat real quick, that would be great so that people can get in touch if they implement some of this. But wanted to thank you for joining us, giving us this fantastic presentation. We'll have it uploaded to YouTube soon so that people can watch it on demand. I did want to reemphasize with the upcoming Keep Austin Agile conference. We actually have the membership deal going on right now. I didn't actually send this out earlier, but you can go to agileaustin.org/join and you can get a discount on your ticket. So and check out on LinkedIn Richard's information there. You can copy and paste that. And we'll also have the links to the YouTube upload on the meetup page afterwards. So again, Richard, thank you so much for your time. One last thing on the Keep Austin Agile, because I forgot earlier, Melissa Boggs as well as David Hawks will be our keynote speakers, and we'll also have some other sessions there as well. So thanks again, Richard. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Richard.
Bye.
Bye-bye.